We are getting a new update in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. According to investigators, a single strand of hair recovered during a secondary search is now being re-examined. At first, it was logged as routine evidence, nothing unusual, nothing urgent. But that has changed, because the location where that hair was found does not fully align with what investigators believed about Nancy's last known movements. And if that detail holds, it introduces a contradiction. Not about what happened, but about where it may have happened. If you find yourself paying attention to details like this, the small things that don't seem important at first, but slowly begin to change the entire direction of a case, consider subscribing. It helps keep these investigations going. And it means you won't miss the moments where everything starts to shift. And as you continue watching, I want you to keep one question in mind. Does that strand of hair suggest Nancy was somewhere investigators didn't expect? Or does it point to something that hasn't been revealed yet? Let me know what stands out to you in the comments. Sometimes a single observation is enough to change how the whole story is understood. At the same time, officials have not confirmed whether the hair belongs to Nancy. Testing is ongoing. But sources say the reason it is now being prioritized is not just the sample itself, it's where it was discovered. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to the beginning of the case. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing after a sudden break in routine. According to those close to her, she was consistent, predictable in the way many people are with daily habits, regular calls, regular check-ins, a schedule that rarely shifted without notice. So when that pattern stopped, it stood out. At first, the concern was limited. A missed call, a delayed response, nothing that immediately suggested danger. But as the hours passed, that silence became harder to explain. And eventually, it became the starting point of the investigation. According to investigators, Nancy's phone activity stopped abruptly. Not gradually, not reduced over time. It stopped. At the same time investigators were waiting for confirmation on the hair sample, the focus began to shift in a very specific direction. Because once a piece of physical evidence challenges the timeline, everything around it has to be rechecked. According to investigators, the area where the strand was found was not random. It had already been searched once before, cleared, at least on the surface. No major findings, nothing that suggested Nancy had spent time there. So the question became simple. How was something missed the first time? And why is it appearing significant now? That's where things began to change. Because during the second review of that location, it wasn't just the hair that drew attention. It was the condition of the surrounding environment. Small details, subtle disturbances that, on their own, would not have raised concern. But when viewed alongside the new evidence, they began to align differently. According to sources, investigators noted inconsistencies in the way the area had been previously documented. Not errors exactly, but gaps. Sections that were not examined as closely as others. Angles that may have been overlooked during the initial search. At the same time, officials have not confirmed whether those gaps were due to human oversight or simply limitations during the first sweep. But the result is the same. Something was missed, and now, that missed detail may be central to understanding what happened. As the timeline was adjusted to include this location, attention returned to Nancy's final known movements. Because if she had been in that area, even briefly, then the sequence leading up to her disappearance changes. According to investigators, her last confirmed sighting still places her within a familiar routine. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was heading somewhere unfamiliar or isolated. But that's where the contradiction deepens. Because the area where the hair was found is not part of that routine. It is not a place she was known to visit regularly. And that raises a question investigators are now working to answer. Did she go there willingly, Or was she taken there? At the same time, digital data is being examined again with greater precision. Nearby device signals, passive connections, background pings that might not have been considered relevant during the first review. Because even when a phone goes silent, other devices can still leave traces. And in this case, investigators believe there may have been more than one device present in that area during the critical window. That detail has not been confirmed publicly, but it is being explored. If true, it introduces another layer, because it suggests that Nancy may not have been alone. Then there is the timing. According to sources, the estimated window between Nancy's last known activity and the potential placement of the hair does not fully align with the original timeline. There is a delay, not a large one, but enough to suggest that the sequence of events did not happen all at once. At the same time, investigators are cautious with that interpretation. Hair can be transferred. It can appear in a location without direct presence at that moment. But again, context matters. And when this detail is placed alongside the rest of the case, it becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. That's where behavioral analysis comes back into focus, because individuals connected to Nancy's final hours are now being examined again, not just for what they said, but for how their accounts fit into this revised timeline. According to investigators, certain statements that once appeared consistent are now being re-evaluated against this new location, and small differences are becoming more noticeable. Not contradictions that stand on their own, but shifts, changes in sequence, slight adjustments in timing, details that may have seemed insignificant before, but now carry more weight. At the same time, officials have not indicated that these differences confirm anything. Memory is not perfect. People recall events differently. But when those variations begin to cluster around a specific point in the timeline, they become relevant. Then there is one more element that has begun to surface: movement. According to sources, a vehicle believed to be connected to someone within Nancy's circle may have passed near the area in question during the time frame investigators are now focusing on. The footage is not clear enough to confirm who was inside. It does not show a stop. It does not show interaction. But the timing overlaps, and once again, it introduces proximity. At the same time, investigators are careful not to draw conclusions from a single data point. But when movement, digital traces, and physical evidence begin to align, even loosely, they create a direction, and that direction is now being followed. Still, there is something that does not fully fit, because if Nancy was in that location, and if there were others present, and if movement occurred shortly after, then why was there no immediate sign of disturbance, no report, no witness? No clear indication that something unusual had taken place. That absence is now part of the investigation, because sometimes what isn't seen matters just as much as what is. And that brings the focus back to the hair. Because if it is confirmed to belong to Nancy, it doesn't just place her in that location. It places her there within a sequence that has yet to be fully explained. A sequence that now includes a break in communication, a possible change in location, unverified presence of additional devices, and movement that overlaps too closely to ignore. At the same time, investigators are still working to determine whether all of these elements connect, or whether some are coincidental. That distinction has not been made yet, but the direction of the case has clearly shifted. Because what was once a single point of disappearance is now potentially part of a chain of events, and that chain may involve more than one step, and possibly more than one person, which leads investigators to a question they have not yet answered. If Nancy's presence in that location is confirmed, and if others were there at the same time, then what exactly happened in those moments? And why has no one been able to fully account for them? No outgoing messages, no incoming responses, no background activity that would suggest the device was still in use. That moment, when her phone went inactive, became the first fixed point in the timeline. Everything else was built around it. At the same time, there were no immediate signs of disturbance at her residence, no forced entry, no clear indication of a struggle. Nothing that pointed directly to a specific event occurring inside that space, and that created the first gap. Because if something had happened, it didn't leave visible evidence where it was expected. That's where things began to shift. Investigators started looking beyond the immediate environment. Surveillance footage, nearby movements, digital traces. They began expanding outward, trying to understand what happened just before that moment of silence. According to reports, Nancy had been seen earlier that day. Routine movement, familiar locations. Nothing that suggested she was heading into a situation that would disrupt her normal pattern. But one detail stood out. A brief interaction. At the time, it didn't seem important. It was not unusual. It fit within the normal rhythm of her day. But when investigators began reconstructing the timeline, that interaction fell very close to the moment her phone went inactive. And that's where it started to matter. Because timing, in cases like this, often reveals more than the event itself. At the same time, investigators have not publicly identified the individual involved in that interaction, only that it is being reviewed again. But that's not what brought the case back into focus. It was the search. According to officials, a secondary search was conducted in an area that had already been examined once before. Not because new information had surfaced immediately, but because something about the original timeline didn't fully align. And during that second search, the hair was found. A single strand, initially overlooked, documented, but not prioritized. Until now. Because the position of that strand, according to investigators, suggests movement that had not been accounted for in the original reconstruction. Not a large shift, but enough to question whether Nancy had been in that location longer than previously believed, or whether she had been moved through it at a different time. At the same time, officials are being cautious. Hair evidence on its own does not confirm presence at a specific moment. It can be transferred. It can be displaced. It can appear in places without direct connection to an event. But context matters. And in this case, the context is what's raising concern. Because when investigators revisited the timeline with that location in mind, small inconsistencies began to surface, not obvious ones, but patterns that didn't fully match. According to sources, there are gaps between known movements and confirmed sightings. Moments where Nancy's exact location cannot be firmly placed. And until now, those gaps were treated as uncertainty. But with this new piece of evidence, they may represent something else. At the same time, digital data is also being reviewed again. Nancy's phone stopped at a specific moment. That hasn't changed. But other data points, nearby device signals, background connections, environmental logs, are now being re-examined alongside this new location. And that's where things begin to shift again. Because if her phone stopped in one place, but physical evidence suggests she may have been somewhere else shortly after, then the timeline is no longer a straight line. It becomes layered. And that changes how investigators approach everything that follows. Then there is the question of behavior. According to those familiar with the case, individuals connected to Nancy's routine have been re-interviewed. Not broadly, but with focus on specific moments. Who saw her? When they saw her? What stood out? And in those interviews, small differences have emerged. Nothing dramatic, but variations in timing, differences in recall, details that don't fully align when placed side by side. At the same time, investigators have not suggested that these inconsistencies indicate wrongdoing. Memory can shift. Perception can vary, especially when events are reconstructed after the fact. But when those variations begin to overlap with physical evidence, they become harder to dismiss. That's where the hair becomes significant, not because of what it is, but because of what it challenges. Because up until now, the assumption was that Nancy's last confirmed location was also the place where her movement stopped. Now, that assumption is being questioned, and if it changes, then everything connected to it changes as well. The timeline, the sequence, the people involved. At the same time, officials have not confirmed how this new evidence will impact the direction of the investigation. Testing is ongoing. Analysis is still in progress. But one thing is clear. The case is no longer being viewed in the same way it was at the beginning, because what was once a single point of disappearance is now potentially part of a larger path. And that path has not been fully mapped yet. Which leads to one final question investigators are now trying to answer. If that strand of hair is confirmed to belong to Nancy, and if it places her in a location outside her last known position, then what happened in the time between those 2 points? And who was there with her? As investigators move further into this revised timeline, the focus is no longer on whether the hair matters. It is on what it connects to. Because once testing began, the question shifted from possibility to confirmation. According to investigators, preliminary results have now been reviewed. Officials have not released full lab reports, but sources indicate that the strand is consistent with Nancy Guthrie's known profile. Not conclusively confirmed in public statements, but no longer considered incidental. And that changes the structure of the case again. Because if the hair belongs to Nancy, then she was in that location at some point after her last confirmed movement. At the same time, investigators are careful. Hair evidence does not establish exact timing. It cannot, on its own, determine when it was left behind. But it does establish presence. And in this case, that presence challenges the original assumption that Nancy's movement stopped at a single point. Now, the timeline extends. And with that extension, new pressure is placed on everything that follows. According to officials, the area where the strand was found is now being treated as a critical point in the sequence, not the beginning, not necessarily the end, but a moment in between, a moment that has yet to be explained. That's where investigators began to focus on connection. Not just where Nancy was, but who else could be linked to that same space during the same window. Digital analysis was expanded again. Nearby devices, temporary connections, background signals that overlap in time without drawing attention on their own. And this time, something surfaced. According to sources, there was at least one additional device that appeared briefly within range of that location during the revised time frame. It did not remain long. It did not generate continuous data, but it appeared, and then it was gone. At the same time, investigators have not publicly identified the owner of that device. It remains an open point. But its presence introduces a new layer. Because now, the possibility that Nancy was not alone in that location becomes harder to dismiss. Then there is movement. Surveillance footage that had been reviewed once and set aside was brought back into focus. Not because it showed something obvious, but because it overlapped with this new understanding of the timeline. And in that footage, the same vehicle previously mentioned appears again. Not once, but more than once. The movements are subtle, a pass-through, a return, nothing that clearly signals urgency. But the repetition stands out, because it suggests familiarity with the area. At the same time, investigators are still working to determine who was inside the vehicle during those moments. The footage does not provide that level of clarity, but the pattern is now part of the case. And when that pattern is placed alongside the presence of another device and the confirmed link of Nancy to that location, it begins to form something more structured, not a complete picture, but no longer fragmented. Then there is the question of behavior, because individuals connected to Nancy's final hours have now been interviewed again under this revised framework. Not just asked what they remember, but asked to account for specific windows of time, where they were, what they were doing, who they were with. And in those interviews, according to investigators, the same issue has surfaced again. Gaps, not large ones, but consistent. Moments where time is not fully accounted for, where explanations exist, but do not fully align with the sequence now being built. At the same time, officials are careful not to interpret those gaps as proof of involvement. Memory is not precise. People forget details, especially under pressure. But when multiple gaps begin to overlap with the same time frame, they become harder to ignore. That's where the case now sits, between confirmation and explanation. Because investigators have a strand of hair that places Nancy in a location outside her expected path. They have digital signals suggesting that another device was present in that same area. They have vehicle movement that overlaps with that window, more than once. And they have gaps in personal accounts that fall into the same sequence. Individually, each of these details can be explained. Together, they begin to form a pattern. At the same time, there is still no confirmed account of what actually happened in that location. No witness has come forward. No direct evidence has been released that explains the event itself, only the structure around it. And that leaves one final layer: intent. Because if Nancy was in that location, and if others were present, and if movement followed shortly after, then whatever happened there was not random. It had direction, it had sequence, and it left behind just enough detail to be traced, but not enough to be fully understood. At least, not yet. According to investigators, further analysis is ongoing. Additional testing, continued review of digital records, follow-up interviews. All of it focused on narrowing the gap between what is known and what has not yet been explained. But even now, one question continues to sit at the center of the case, because if that single strand of hair is what finally shifted the investigation, then what else was missed the first time? That could change everything again.